could not do this without them. So thank you to all of our library staff. And then also, just a reminder that we are all a group of volunteers. And so we have some volunteers who have really worked hard. And first of all, I'd like to thank Bobby Falke, who can't be here today, but her team is, and they are carrying on admirably without her. So thank you to all of her team. They take care of the registration and all the ticket taking and everything. So we appreciate that. I also like to thank Jan Keaty, who keeps us fed and happy. She's been taking care. She has a team that takes care of the hostessing every time, so we do appreciate that. And then lastly, I'd especially like to thank Don Schilling. Don has really been doing double duty lately. He takes care of our speaker and all the logistics dealing with that this morning. I think he even drove to Richmond to pick up our speaker, so that we appreciate. And also, right now he's taking care of Mary, whom we all miss. But thank you, Don, for all of your help. And now I'm going to turn it over to Don to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Sudie. And again, thanks to you for being here on this February 25th. I'm going to give you the traditional reminders, and you do a good job, but silence these devices. On the mics for question and answer will be Les Solomon and Diane Lederer. And just raise your hand and they will get a mic to you. And you have been asking excellent questions. Just keep that up. We again are having this program taped and will be shown on the James City Council site, YouTube. We are still working to get the session on artificial intelligence up. There were some problems with the audio, and I thought perhaps they had been solved, but when I looked at the site this morning, it was still not up. But we do have the program on India and Pakistan now available, in addition to Larry Wilkerson's program on climate change. So before I introduce our speaker, just a reminder that next week we do not have a program. You may be aware that this is primary season. It may have crossed, you may have seen some indications of that. Because next Tuesday is Super Tuesday and Virginia is involved with that. If you are voting in the Democratic primary, you will have that opportunity. Republicans are not having a primary, so you can stay home. The result is that because we have 5 Tuesdays in March, we're able to skip this first Tuesday, and we will gather again on March 10th, where it'll be our privilege to hear from Mr. Hank Hendrickson, who is the Executive Director of the U.S.-Philippines Society, on the topic of the Philippines and the U.S. He currently is in the Philippines, so when he comes back to speak to us, he will be very current about the issues involved. Today we have Maria Fernanda Perez with us, who is the Associate Director of the Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. She comes originally from Costa Rica. When she came to university studies, she went off to Paris and the Sorbonne, where she did a BA. Then she came to the United States first she returned to Costa Rica and did a MA in International Law and Human Rights at the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica, and then came to the United States, where she did an MA in Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. Following completion of that degree, she began her work at the Latin American Center in 2015, where as assistant director, she pioneered and co-led the center's Northern Triangle Task Force, producing events in the DC and Guatemala, and a capstone report with a former president, vice president, and 2 former ministers from the region on the issues of the Northern Triangle. Now, as Associate Director, she is in charge of program strategy for Mexico, Central America, and for the thematic emphasis on anti-corruption efforts. She creates and manages collaborations in the U.S. and Latin America between businesses, agencies, scholars, and diplomats, including business executives, ministers, governors, and former and current heads of state. Now, she could be delivering her comments today in Spanish, in French, in Italian, or Portuguese. We are fortunate that she has chosen to speak to us in English.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. Now, how many of you had a cup of coffee this morning? Okay, lots of you. Chances are that that cup of coffee came from the Northern Triangle. Well, 2 out of the 3 countries that comprise the Northern Triangle are big exporters of coffee. So is Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama. We are very proud of the fact that our coffee is one of the best in the world. So let's get this started. Where is the Northern Triangle? Even, this is a funny anecdote, but every week each center puts together a memo for the president of the Atlantic Council on our activities. Back in 2015, when we were first leading and starting this effort, we included that in our weekly memo, and we said, we're leading this effort on the Northern Triangle, this is what we plan on doing. And then a couple days later, the president of the Atlantic Council asked in all caps, what is the Northern Triangle? And so it's a very common question. I love it when people ask me where it is and what it is, because it's right next door. If you take a plane from Miami, you can be in Managua in over 3 hours, same in Guatemala, in El Salvador, Honduras. So it's actually, some of these distances are shorter from the US than it is to go from the east to the west coast. And so that explains why I think it is so important to talk about this and to really understand what is happening in the Northern Triangle. Geography is destiny, and the truth is that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are right next door, and so what happens there has a direct impact here in the United States. The economic prosperity and security of the Northern Triangle is linked to the economic prosperity and security of the United States. So that's what we're going to talk about. Bob, is there a way for me to click on this link? Okay. So I just want to show you a video of the, I guess not. Okay. It's not working. That's okay. You know, my generation really depends on technology. And so now I'm scrambling in my head. No, it's okay. I just wanted to show a video of that Northern Triangle Task Force that Don was making reference to at the beginning. It's a really nice video, but I can share that later with all of you. So I want to start by talking about the historical background, a very brief overview. I could spend hours and days talking about the history of Central America, and in particular, these 3 countries, but I will spare you that. Then I want to fast forward to today, talk about the push factors, what is driving people out of the Northern Triangle. When we talk about migration from the Northern Triangle, it's very important to emphasize on the push factors more so than the pull factors, what they could find here in the United States. And then I would like to finalize by looking ahead at the short, medium, and long term, what can we expect what are some recommendations that from the Atlantic Council we think should be taken into consideration in order to effectively address the situation in the Northern Triangle. Okay, so key dates. I think a good starting point to understand why things are the way they are in Central America today is to go back to the end of World War II, and specifically the Cold War. Latin America was sort of a battleground for the United States. The geopolitics of the Cold War help explain or help us contextualize what was happening in this region that before then the United States didn't really pay any attention to because there was really no reason to. But in 1959, the Cuban Revolution, where Batista, the president at the time, was ousted by Castro, the communist leader, was a big wake-up call to the United States. And so from that moment on, the United States focused on containment of communism in the backyard, so to speak. And although the United States was really encouraging the countries in Central America to transition into civil democracies, to move away from military authoritarian regimes, the truth is that the number one concern was security, and so security and containment of communism would trump those ideals of democracy and liberal values. An example of this happens a few years before the Cuban Revolution, but we started to see the signs before the revolution, but the revolution, again, was the big wake-up call. In 1954, this president in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, who was not, by any account, a, so to speak, communist, he was very liberal-minded. He had this big plan of land reform. Many of the issues that are still persistent today in Central America go back to the 19th century when there were big families who owned up to a third or half of the country, and so the wealth was very concentrated. And today, Latin America is, with Africa, the most unequal region in the world, and that is especially the case in Central America. A few countries or a few families still today, even in Panama and Costa Rica, own a lot of the wealth. So Jacobo Arbenz wanted to change that, and so he had an ambitious land reform program that the US construed as he could be easily influenced by communism. And so that was the biggest sort of intervention from the United States. And okay, then we have, again, at this time, the leftist revolutionary groups who are starting to appear, who are starting to make demands that, wealth is distributed throughout the population, that not just a few people who own the land have the rights and the wealth and land. And then this starts to bubble up. In the 1970s, we have a lot of political unrest and economic crises that start to make headlines all over the world. And at this point in the 1970s, all Central American countries, with the exception of Costa Rica and Panama, have military authoritarian regimes. And the US is happy about this because we're okay as long as you're not leftist, as long as you're not communist or vulnerable to going down that path. However, this changes in the mid-1970s when President Carter says, I do not agree with this. We are not going to back these anti-humane regimes, and we are going to put democracy at the forefront. That is what is going to lead and shape US policy. And so that worked until 1979 when we have a big coup in Nicaragua The Sandinistas, also a leftist regime, takes over, and so the US reverses its policy and goes back to the #1 containment policy. So by the 1980s, we have a lot of people dead, over 300,000 people dead, millions of refugees as a result of, in the 60s, the criminal groups that are popping up everywhere, and as a result of the poverty, as a result of the violence and insecurity that is already showing signs in these countries. And also, Guatemala and El Salvador have big civil conflicts. So that adds to everything else that is happening, these civil countries. At the end of the 80s, a Costa Rican president at the time, Oscar Arias, helps the countries broker a peace agreement, which is we know as the Esquipulas Agreement, in the late 1980s. By the 1990s, we start seeing these transitions to liberal democracies in Nicaragua. We see it in Guatemala. We see it in El Salvador and in Honduras. So I would say that since then, we have not had a long piece of stability in the Northern Triangle. We go back and forth. The scars of this time are still very present. At this time is when we have the famous MS-13 gangs start to form in Los Angeles, and they start to be deported to El Salvador, and they are not reintegrated into society, and so they're wreaking havoc. So we're still seeing that. And fast forward to today, the Northern Triangle is known in our field as Latin America's most murderous corner. It's not a distinction that we are particularly proud of. And although homicide rates have been declining since a few years ago, they are still more than average, more than double the average of the rest of Latin America. It is particularly bad for women in the Northern Triangle. Women, as well as men who identify as homosexuals. It is very bad. We have a 98% impunity rate in Honduras. So very few cases are actually even prosecuted or investigated. So you can literally get away with murder. And so that is one of the main reasons that people are fleeing, is to escape their partners, to escape the violence that is just so common in Central America. Let me see if this video will play. Yes. That
really inspire us.
Yeah.
To fix things, to change things, to push the world forward. Thousands of Central American migrants.
Bob, no? Okay. Well, let's see if I can get the PowerPoint back up. Okay, so once again, technology fails me. This video is a short video, very powerful. It shows it follows a little girl who is crossing the border. They identify her or they see her in Guatemala, and they see that she's with two men who, it's obvious that she doesn't know who these men are. And They try to talk to her. They ask her if she's okay. It's very obviously a case of human smuggling, and she's on her way to first Mexico and then the United States. So that's very, it's so common. If you have some means, you will use those means to pay coyotes, human smugglers, to help you make your trek to the United States. People pay on average $3,000 to $5,000, which is really big. I mean, it's a big amount here in the United States. It's even bigger in these countries where there are low-paying jobs, where there aren't jobs, for example, in Guatemala. And so just imagine how long it takes, or what people are willing to do to get that money quickly, because the truth is that Central Americans, most of them, they realize that they have to leave. They have to leave tonight because my daughter was just threatened. They just threatened to rape her if her brother doesn't join the gang, or the father is late on his payment to the local gang, which is called la renta, which means rent in Spanish. And so what a lot of these gangs do, where the state isn't present, is that they extort the local families. So if 5,000 is a big number here in the United States, just imagine what lengths these people have to go through to get that money in order to hopefully get away from all that chaos and danger. So, like I was saying, Central America today is plagued by violence. We have criminal gangs in the 3 Northern Triangle countries that serve as sort of paramilitary. I mean, they are like the state. They have authority. They control rural areas where, because of things like poor infrastructure, like poor road infrastructure, there is no state and there are no public services. That is where we see a lot of the gangs, as well as gender-based violence. I think it's too simplistic to say that sexism is and misogynism is a Latin American problem. There are a lot of people in the field who want to attribute the gender-based violence to the way that we are, and I think that's too simplistic, and it's much more complicated than that. But violence, poverty, there is an absolute lack of economic opportunities because governments and private businesses aren't investing in these countries, because why would they? There's no rule of law. There's no guarantee that the government is going to respect your business or contracts. There's no guarantee that a criminal group is going to come and take over your business. There's no guarantee of anything. These states are so fragile. This goes back to the 1970s, where we started to see these political crises. These states are so fragile that there are no economic opportunities. And in Guatemala, specifically, climate change is playing a huge role and is going to continue to play a huge role in pushing people out of their countries. Guatemala depends a lot on agriculture, and for the last couple of years, there's been a really long and severe drought, especially in the Western Highlands, which is where most of the indigenous populations are. They are already a susceptible group, a vulnerable group, and they are being affected by climate change and droughts, their crop failure, food insecurity. These are all factors that are pushing people away. And then the other big third, I think, pillar that can help us start to explain why people are leaving is the fragile states. I mean, these are almost, some scholars will call these Northern Triangle states failed states. I think that things are improving a little bit, and so they're fragile. They're not failed yet, but the judicial system is backlogged. The AG, Attorney General offices, have no capacity to prosecute any crimes. That's why we see these really high impunity rates. That's why people know that they can get away with murder. Or, for example, in Guatemala, the justice system has become so politicized that it's just not working. The justice system, the AG, is out looking for opponents and enemies of whatever political party is in power. And then there's the deep-seated corruption, which is just I think a product of all of these, like lack of economic opportunities, the criminal gangs. Corruption is one of the biggest problems, and so far as there's no transparency, no accountability, people in Central America and the Northern Triangle see public office as a means to get rich, and because of all the corruption that is going on, especially in public contracting. All of these factors are leading to forced migration. And I think it's important to emphasize that it is forced migration. You hear a lot of people in the news, or you see a lot of people saying they should just stop, should just stay in their countries. But there is no understanding of why they are coming, and that's why at the beginning I was saying, I think it's important to understand the push factors, that this is a forced migration, that people have no options. It's literally to leave or not to leave, and if you don't leave, you will die. And it's not so much the pull factors, which is what this administration has been wanting to make it all about. It's not about people wanting to come to the United States and take advantage of the public services here. It's really that the conditions in their country are so, so bad that they don't have any other options. So today's policies, and although I represent a nonpartisan think tank, we are very proud of the great ties and relationships that we have in the Senate on both the R and the D side. I think it's totally fair to say that the policies of this administration are equal to shooting yourself in the foot. This administration's stance towards this phenomenon of immigration, which, by the way, is, as long as humanity has been around, migration has been a thing. I was saying their stance is one of deterrence and very, very reactive. When instead, and this is something that we say in our task force report, we should be more proactive, and we should be doing more addressing of the factors that are pushing people away. We should be more proactive instead of reactive, instead of focusing on the border. The southern border is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's just the last point, and then there's all these other things that come before it that are much more important. So today's policies have made the migration crisis much worse. Starting in February 2017, a month after President Trump took office, he put a cap on asylum requests. He actually sliced them in half, so it was the United States had a cap on 110,000 cases per year. He brought that down to 50,000, and then this year we're down to 18,000. To be fair, the United States asylum system was never equipped or was never envisioned to be processing these many asylum cases. But this has not been helpful, because these people are leaving Central America because they are going to be killed because of their sexual orientation, or because they're female, or because they refuse to pay the local gang. And that is a credible fear of persecution. And they're coming here, and there are no incentives to do things the right way, which is go get in line and say, I'm here, I'm requesting asylum. There is no incentives to do that when you know that there's no capacity to process your request. And so that is one major thing that has exacerbated this crisis. A year later, the Trump administration rolled out this last in, first out, which is, last out, first out, which is that they would start processing the cases of people who had last arrived, and they would process those cases quickly, and then like more than 90% of those cases would be rejected. And so then they had them there, they would quickly deport them back to where they came from. Later that summer, Attorney General Jeff Sessions elevated the threshold for fear. So it became much more difficult for especially women to show that they were in danger of being killed by their partner or ex-partner back in their countries. And the ACLU has some cases against the Trump administration because this is a violation of civil rights. You can't just arbitrarily elevate the threshold of what qualifies as fear. A year ago, the Trump administration also rolled out the Migrant Protection Protocol, or better known as Remain in Mexico, which meant that the Northern Triangle asylum seekers would be sent, once they had their court papers with a date on when they should appear in court, they would send them back to Mexico, which is just as bad as, if not worse, as the Northern Triangle countries. Mexico is a very violent country. Homicide rates last year were at a historic high. Mexico is also the most dangerous country for journalists after Syria. It's the most dangerous country for journalists in Latin America. And you are sending the migrants back to a place that is just as bad, if not as bad as, if not worse, as where they came from. And then what they were doing is that, say I came and I applied for asylum, they gave me my papers, I complied, I went back to Mexico, I somehow spent 2 months there, and I'm still alive, and my court date is tomorrow. I'm trying to come back in, and they don't let me come back in. And so, of course, that incentivizes people to do things, again, the wrong way. Why am I going to go stand in line, go back to Mexico where I could be killed, and then try to come back and be denied? I might as well just sneak in and never let anyone know I'm here, because the alternative is much more scary. A few months later, the Trump administration, oh, by the way, the MPP is now being phased out because the numbers have dwindled so much that the Trump administration believes it's no longer effective, but the truth is that people aren't applying anymore because they already know what's going to happen. So their policy came back to bite them. A few months after that, the Trump administration decides to freeze all foreign assistance to Central America. Now, a point on foreign assistance. People think that it means that Congress For example, Congress will approve $2 billion, which is what happened with Obama in 2014 when we had the big spike in children in unaccompanied minor migration. President Obama requested Congress, who has the power of the purse, to appropriate $2 billion for programs in Central America, programs that would help with these factors that we were talking about, programs that would help create economic opportunities, programs in Guatemala that would help combat some of the effects of climate change. They helped rural farmers with their crops. Programs that helped address violence. There were some programs that were led by USAID and State Department where we saw that in targeted communities there was up to 66% reduction in migration because these programs were being effective. And so aid, again, is not money that is going to the countries. It goes to civil society organizations in the region that are working on addressing youth violence and that are dedicated to youth prevention programs. They go to civil society organizations that are helping women become more financially literate, that are helping SMEs. So this idea that has been pushed in some of the media that, you know, why should Congress fund these very corrupt countries? That's not what's happening. One, the money, again, goes to either civil society organizations who have very specific programs with very specific metrics and who are looking for very specific outcomes. That's where that money goes. Or this aid to Central America goes in the form of technical assistance. So a lot of police training, a lot of, for example, AG training the attorney generals and the prosecutors' offices so that they can helping them with the backlog of cases that they have. Also, some FBI training in order to address some of the drug trafficking issues that are very common here. So this was a big mistake, the freezing aid to Central America, because now we have all these implementers in countries, civil society organizations, whose work was actually having an effect and in helping curb migration, because people now had alternatives to migrating, and now that's gone, and now that's been gone for almost a year. So do not be surprised when this summer we see those numbers spike up again. Finally, last summer, the Trump administration also limited the family protections, meaning before then, if you came here as a family unit, it was kind of like your case was fast-tracked, and you got special protections because you were here with minors. That is all being restricted, curbed. And then the funniest one for me, this third safe country agreements, which the United States, until last summer, the United States had one of these agreements with Canada. What that means is that, say you are an asylum seeker coming from Africa, and you're trying to get to the United States, and so in your journey here, you stop in Canada. Canada is deemed a safe third country, is deemed a safe country. And so it means that you stay in Canada and you you request asylum there. Now, the Trump administration coerced the Central American countries last summer to sign those agreements. So this means that Guatemala has a safe third country agreement with the United States. This means that El Salvador has a safe third country agreement with the United States, as well as Honduras. So if we go back to the map. So if I am coming from here, or Nicaragua, which is also having a lot of problems right now because of the dictator that they have, who is curbing all civil rights. A lot of people have been leaving Nicaragua. So if you are coming from Nicaragua and you want to come here to the United States, but you make a stop in Honduras, which is the most dangerous country in the world, the United States thinks that it's safe for you to stay here because we have signed an agreement with them. And so that's what's happening now. That those are the policies that President Trump and his administration have been pursuing. Yes, border crossings are at a low point today. That's also because President Trump has managed to enlist the president of Mexico to sort of do the dirty work for them. And this is something that President Obama had tried to do with the former Mexican president, but the former Mexican president said, I'm not doing that. This Mexican president, recognizing the importance of the United States for his country, the United States is Mexico's #1 trading partner. And in order to keep Mr. Trump appeased, he decided to comply with his demands on migration, and so now Mexico is functionally serving as a wall to migration, and they're doing a lot of the detaining and deporting of migrants. And so, yes, the president and his team can now say that they are being successful in reducing migration, but this is a problem that is going to just continue to fester. We're not addressing the driving factors that are pushing migrants here up north. We are making it worse. And like I said at the beginning, Central America they're our neighbors, and what happens there will inevitably have an effect here. So some of the recommendations that as an organization we have we believe that any policies and any proposed solutions should be holistic and include components in security, rule of law, and economic development. In regards to sustainable economic development, the United States can, mind you, these recommendations are from 2017, so we did not have the cuts to aid yet, but we did recommend Congress to appropriate more money for Central America, kind of like they did for Plan Colombia, which is regarded as the #1 example of bipartisan legislation. With Plan Colombia back in the early 2000s, they approved a big plan and quite a bit of money to help Colombia deal with the drug problems and with the paramilitary forces. And so back in 2017, we thought that that Congress could do a Plan Colombia for Central America, which would mean provide more economic assistance. The United States and businesses from the United States and, for example, finance corporations here from the United States can also help with the infrastructure in these countries. Like I was saying earlier, road infrastructure is a big problem, and it's so basic. If you have no roads, you have no access to the market, you have no access to the outside world. It brings up your shipping costs, it brings up your transportation costs, and it discourages companies from settling there because it's so expensive. And electricity as well. Electricity in the 3 Northern Triangle countries is one of the most expensive in the world because their infrastructure is just so poorly built. It's not connected, it's really expensive to get electricity. And so small or punctual projects to better the infrastructure in these countries can really go a long way. The other area that we had identified was investing in the cities where many people are migrating from. For example, the Western Highlands in Guatemala, where there are big indigenous populations. If we have a concerted effort in the Western Highlands to invest and create economic opportunities and help people with finding prosperity in their own communities, they won't migrate. The other area we identified was information sharing on those being deported to help with reintegration. Reintegration is a big issue. Former gang members who no longer want to be gang members go back to the tiny village they came from, and in a matter of minutes, everyone knows that they're there. And so they're going to go be sought out by the criminal gangs in order to be a part of the gang again, or I will kill you. And so reintegration programs, which again, the United States really helped Colombia with, would be very successful and helpful in the Northern Triangle. And then the other one is focus on human capital. A lot of the population in the Northern Triangle countries is illiterate, and these economies are also very much commodity export driven. And so, for example, the coffee, that's what they do, or textiles in Guatemala. And for example, Costa Rica has a very different model, but a lot of Costa Ricans speak English fairly well, and the economy has transitioned to a services-oriented economy. And so with the support of the United States and the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, we could help train the workforce in the Northern Triangle so that they can move away from those low-paying jobs and focus on helping their economies transition to a knowledge-based economy. In regards to the rule of law, money laundering is a big issue. The countries don't even know where to start. And so a 101 on how to fight money laundering would really go a long way. Again, the judicial system is really backlogged, and so for a while with the U.S. support of Central America, we had judges go to the countries and help them with the backlog of cases. That's not the case anymore because we've cut the funding. Also, rhetoric goes a long way, and for these countries, the United States is the main trading partner, and it's the most important ally. And so a little nudge for these countries to focus on fighting corruption and rewarding these countries with the transparency, with more funding from Congress would really, again, go a long way. And it's also important to note that aid and any funding that is destined or that is directed towards Central America, it's a two-way street. The countries themselves, for every dollar that they get from the United States, they put down $7. And so it's not like it's not charity. Also, in order to help with the rule of law, the United States can send advisors to train the police, help them, manage, help them deal with extortion, and as well as prosecutors and judges to prosecute financial crimes. We've also found that including more women in the police force goes a long way as well. With security, we have some of the same recommendations: send advisors to provide technical assistance and training to the forces, install community police initiatives. The more involved the community is in what's happening, the better the community is. Strengthen police accountability. Again, there are a number of programs on how to do that. But the main focus here is helping police officers know how to deal with any extortion situations. The women in the police force is also a recommendation of ours. And there needs to be more communication between the three countries. The three countries share a lot of the same problems. I'm not saying that they are the same, but they are very similar. They have a lot of similarities, and the truth is that they don't really talk. We have new governments right now in Guatemala and El Salvador, but they refuse to talk to the Honduran government because there are some accusations of electoral fraud in 2017, and the current the brother of the current Honduran president has been charged of drug trafficking case here in the United States, and so he's involved in all of that. So the Salvadoran and the Guatemalan administrations don't talk to the Honduran government, and which is a shame, because if there were more information sharing, we do believe that some of these issues could be better addressed. And then we didn't really talk about drug trafficking and the drug corridors, but Central America has for a long time been a corridor of drugs that come especially from Colombia, and that's a whole other discussion. But with some of the programs that were in place before the United States went ahead and cut them last year, we were seeing important progress with combating drug trafficking. And important thing to note here in regards to drug trafficking, again, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but over 90% of the drugs that come into the United States come through UPS, come through legal border crossings, and not through other. They don't come through illegal ports of entry. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, very discouraging talk. I'm wondering, China is involved with many, many countries all over the world these days. And isn't this area a area that China might be involved with?
Yes, thank you for bringing China up. That is one of the arguments for why we should continue U.S. assistance towards the Northern Triangle, is because where there's a vacuum, China will happily step in. And China has happily stepped in already. In El Salvador, they just announced an investment of over $1 billion. They're going to build libraries, they're going to build bridges, they're going to invest in infrastructure. There are China is a big player in Latin America, and we are particularly concerned with the influence and impact it can have in Central America because these economies are so small. The truth, as a Central American, I think it's very sometimes condescending when from Congress and the administration you have people saying, you better not accept that money from China, you know, and then China comes in with this enormous check, and as really small economies, there comes a point where, sure, I don't share the same values as China, but I really need this investment. And that is why if the United States leaves that vacuum and decides to recede and decides to retreat, then the only natural thing for the governments and administrations in the area is to accept China's money, knowing that it would be preferable if the United States stepped up. But that's not the case. And so El Salvador recently accepted a big investment from China. We don't think that Guatemala is going to recognize China anytime soon is not going to move away from recognizing Taiwan and move to the one China policy anytime soon because the Guatemala-US ties are very strong. It goes back to their support for Israel, and they have a very strong security relationship there. And so we don't see Guatemala moving towards the one China policy anytime soon, but again, it's very concerning that the United States has left this big gap, and actors like China are more than happy to fill it in. So that's a great question. Thank you.
I have a question over here.
I have a three-pronged question. Number one, it looks like these people need to be recycled from their geographical area because of the problems that they have. Number two, the Western Hemisphere has a very large organization. Mm-hmm. How many of these countries, such as Brazil and Argentina, are getting involved? And number three, Brazil is a very large country, has a lot of virgin land that could be developed, and that could resolve possibly the problems that Central America has.
Yeah, so South America is very different from Central America, very wealthy, very developed country. They are also dealing with their own migration crisis with Venezuela. We expect the number of Venezuelan migrants to exceed the number of Syrian migrants this year, which is a big number. I think it's around 4 million. It's an enormous number. And a lot of the countries in South America have been absorbing the migrants. And we're starting to see some of the xenophobia appear in Peru, in Ecuador. But actually the United States has been engaging with Brazil and Panama on some migration talks. I don't know the details, but we also have people from Brazil who are trying to come to the United States and seek asylum. And so with this precedent that they have with President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil is referred to by many as the Trump of the tropics. And so I don't know if he will sign any migration agreement with the United States. It could be because they are actually, right now they're discussing a free trade agreement, which would be huge for the United States to have a free trade agreement with the largest economy in South America, but actually the migration component might come in as part of the deal. We don't know, but yeah, we do know that the sort of the plan B for the administration, if the Central American countries didn't sign these safe third country agreements, they were going to bring into the picture Panama and Brazil, and possibly to ask them to receive migrants.
Is there a question?
So I just wanted to ask, when you look at your maps, there's one little tiny country, Belize, that is surrounded by those other countries plus Mexico on the north. Is there some reason why that is successful, or is it also a problem but we just don't talk about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Belizeans don't really consider themselves Central Americans. They don't speak Spanish either. They're a colony, or sorry, my knowledge of Belize isn't as developed as the others. But Belize has always considered itself as part of the Caribbean, and sort of they consider themselves different. There are a number of problems as well, corruption, but Belize is, when we talk about Central America, there are 7 countries, but we never mention Belize. Yeah.
Over here.
Kind of along the same lines, as a Costa Rican, I understand there are certainly some differences in the history of Costa Rica and how it developed, but it seems like there might be some lessons from your country that could be applied in terms of whether it's learning more English or the way the agrarian economy has developed or anti-corruption efforts. But it's interesting, that Costa Rica was a leader in the region in terms of establishing stability and security, and I wonder if you would comment on that.
Yeah, we're known as the Switzerland of Central America because of our history. We were an early democracy. We abolished the army in 1948, for example, and so the current constitution that we have dates to 1948, which is really rare in our region to just have one constitution. And so I think that there are lessons learned. I think that we have a big role Costa Rica and Panama. Panama has some issues with money laundering, and they're on all the blacklists of on the financial blacklist. But an interesting thing that I think Costa Rica can be the leader of is, and this was explored back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, but it didn't really work out, was the Central America Common Market. The idea behind that is sort of like the European Economic Union, which started off as a common market. We also have common markets in Mercosur. It's Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Uruguay. And what that means is that, there are different levels, different degrees of integration. But Costa Rica can be a leader in promoting regional integration. It could go as simply as having a customs union, and so any goods that would travel around the region would be duty-free, and so that would lower the costs for consumers. That could maybe help boost growth in the Central American countries. And the other extreme, like the European Union, we could have free labor of people movement, free movement of people, free movement of labor, free movement of services and capital. I don't think we're at that point yet. We have seen some encouraging signs. For example, the president of Guatemala recently invited the president of El Salvador to build a port in Guatemala, because El Salvador, let me see if I can pull it up. So El Salvador, this tiny country here, has no access to the Atlantic Ocean. And so the president of Guatemala recently invited El Salvador to build a port here that they would control, the Salvadorians would control, and that would essentially give them access to the Atlantic Ocean. And so that's an encouraging sign of integration, of the countries helping each other out. To your question, I think that Costa Rica is very happy not having the problems that our neighbors up north have, but I do think that we could step up and kind of promote and encourage that kind of actions. I think that also, to be fair to my country, this big pink thing here, Nicaragua, is having a lot of problems. Costa Rica has received over 40,000 Nicaraguan immigrants in the past year, which is a lot. Our country is not equipped. I mean, I think we're equipped to manage fewer than 100 asylum cases a year, and then in a period of 6 months, we had 40,000 people come seeking refuge from the oppressiveness of Daniel Ortega. And so maybe, to be fair to Costa Rica, maybe the situation in Nicaragua is hampering us taking a more proactive role, but I think that I would love to see more signs of this push for an economic integration.
Yes, in reading the information, the article that was in the booklet for the Great Decisions, it appears that most of the guns that are used by the criminals in Central America are coming from the United States,
Yep.
and that the need for this drug trafficking from the south to the north is because of the great demand for these illegal drugs in the United States. Is there something you could, in your recommendations for what the U.S. could do to halt both of those things, or to at least cut it back?
Yeah, we like to say that so long as there's demand here, we're always going to have this problem of drug trafficking. And so the U.S. should start by addressing the very real public health issue, problem that exists here with the drug use and drug problems. As long as there's demand, you will find there will be a supply. In regards to the arms, yes, a lot of the arms and weapons that the criminal gangs have come from the United States, and this became an issue a few months ago when, I don't know if you remember, but in October or November of last year, a Mexican-American family, the Le Baron family, they're Mormons, were killed in Sinaloa, and it was, we woke up, I think it was November 5th, and it's like, what just happened? And of course, the Mexicans were trying to explain it. It happened up in Sinaloa, which is dominated by the cartels and the gangs. They're very powerful. But it was found that the weapons used in that massacre had come from the United States. And so the Mexican Minister for Foreign Affairs and the U.S. ambassador in Mexico, they raised the issue, and they said, if we want to see improvements in the security of Mexico and Central America, then we need to address the smuggling of arms that is coming from the north to the south. So in order to answer your question, since then, unfortunately, we had to have an event like that happen. But since then, there's been a task force that has been formed to address this issue. I don't know where it's at. I don't know what they've found. I'd be happy to connect with you later and look into that. But that's, as long as that problem isn't resolved, the problem of smuggling arms to the south, then it's going to keep happening.
We've discussed both China and Panama a little bit this morning. Can you share any knowledge of China's influence in Panama currently, specifically along the Panama Canal?
Yeah, China, very interested in Panama, has been for a long time. Panama as well as Costa Rica, but Panama because of the canal. Actually, for a time, a few years ago, there were discussions that the Chinese were going to build their embassy at the foot of the canal in order to show their influence in Central America and in Panama specifically. We see a lot of Chinese influence in Panama, and also it's no longer a thing, but for a few years, China wanted to build a dry corridor in Nicaragua. There were all these environmental impact assessments that showed that it was not a feasible project, but the government went ahead and started construction on that with the help of China. China put down a lot of money, I don't know how much, and the project doesn't exist anymore. Like it was not viable, but China has tried to assert itself and to really have a stronghold in Central America, and yes, they're very involved in Panama, very interested in the Panama Canal. I think that Panama is where most Chinese are in Central America, just to give you an idea.
Question over here. Some of us may contribute to microfinancing projects like HEVA, where you give a small amount, $25, and they're paid back like $1, $2 at a time. Are those effective as a way for individuals to really make a difference on a person-to-person type?
Is HEVA?
HEVA, K-I-V-A, Kiva?
Kiva, I don't know
familiar
Kiva.
with it? Well, they're microfinancing projects where you're
microfinancing.
actually helping an individual with their farming or a small business.
Yeah, those are those organizations probably also were receiving money from state and USAID, because those are the implementer organizations that I was making reference to. And so, for example, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which looks into this type of things, the effectiveness of foreign assistance, found that a lot of the implementers that before were relying on foreign assistance from Congress were now moving more towards the model where they would receive donations from people here and elsewhere in an effort to continue with their operations. I don't know Kiva specifically, but it does sound like it's one of those implementer organizations that were doing the work that were carrying out the programs that were designed from USAID and state with the help of local partners. So.
I think we have time for one question, so here it is. You have just a few minutes to get back to your iPhone and send your best question for the debate tonight. What will it be that will engender a good conversation on this problem?
Whoa, that's a great question. No, unfortunately, I haven't seen the candidates talk about this issue. I've heard them talk about migration, but it's a very different issue. President Biden, I'm speaking in the future. At the time, Vice President Biden we saw him as a champion for Central America. He was really supportive of President Obama's strategy for engagement for Central America. He was there all the time. He really made an effort to understand these countries. And so I think it would be important to hear the candidates talk about Central America. I haven't seen it. I think that the default, and maybe it's because it just works better politically to talk just about migration. But they're two separate issues. They're linked. We talk about Central America always in the context of the migration to the north. But again, the solutions I think, have to be focused in country. They have to be holistic. You can't just focus on security. You can't just focus on economic prosperity, because they're all linked. So I'm not answering your question, but that's what I think that, unfortunately, I have not seen many of the candidates talk about Central America. I don't know how much they know about Central America. Yeah, actually, if I can brag for 1 second, I worked on this blog post for the Atlantic Council talking about gender-based violence, and it ended up in Elizabeth Warren's immigration plan. And so I don't know if she's read it, but yeah, I would like to see, to conclude, I would like to see the candidates talk about Central America. I would like to see them really understand how these issues are linked, but they're not the same. And I think that would put us on a path to help our neighbors in the South find economic prosperity and security in their own countries. They're the first ones who don't want to leave. And so, yeah, thank you.
Much, Maria. It might be a gotcha question for our debaters tonight, but we could ask them, can you name the countries in the Northern Triangle